Richard was standing at the head of the conference table, while the partners praised him as a genius for a courtroom win built on a lie, and I sat in the corner holding a copy of the one email that could put our client behind bars. I watched him shake hands with the senior leadership, smiling for them, knowing the real smoking gun was already buried in the firm's document system under a fake reference code, and my finger hovered over the send button to the federal investigators. I was ready to trade 6 years of my career for the chance to watch Richard and this entire firm go down in flames. Before we continue and find out how it all began, please subscribe and leave a like. We'd truly love to read your comments below. I learned to hold my breath in meetings long before I understood why. It wasn't a rule anyone explained, just something you figured out by watching who spoke and who didn't. The ones who spoke were the ones who mattered. The rest of us sat still, nodded when expected, and kept our corrections to ourselves. That was the deal. The firm operated like a well-oiled machine, each layer stacked neatly above the last. Associates at the bottom, partners at the top, and somewhere in the middle, people like me. Mid-level enough to be trusted with real work, low enough to be reminded daily that trust was conditional. The architecture was elegant, I had to give them that. Everyone knew their place, and the system rewarded those who stayed in it. I had been with the firm for 6 years, long enough to stop flinching when they passed over my name for credit on a project. Long enough to understand that loyalty meant more than competence, and silence was a form of currency. I paid my dues. I showed up early, stayed late, and learned to smile when Richard Calloway took my analysis and presented it as his own during client reviews. Richard was a senior partner, the kind of man who wore his authority like a tailored suit. He never raised his voice because he didn't need to. A glance was enough to make you second-guess yourself. A pause long enough to remind you that your position was a courtesy, not a right. He had mentored me once back when I was new and didn't know better. He told me I had potential, that I was smart, that if I played my cards right, I could go far. I believed him. The unraveling started on a Tuesday morning in April. I was at my desk reviewing contract amendments for a merger deal we had been working on for 3 months. The client was a mid-sized pharmaceutical company looking to acquire a smaller competitor, and the terms were delicate. One misstep in the language and the whole thing could collapse into litigation. I had spent weeks combing through the fine print. I flagged inconsistencies and built a framework that would hold up under scrutiny. Richard walked into my office without knocking. He did that sometimes, a casual assertion of access. He dropped a stack of documents on my desk and leaned against the door frame with his arms crossed. "We need to adjust the liability clauses," he said. "Clients getting cold feet about indemnity provisions." I looked up from my screen. The current structure protects them from downstream claims. If we adjust it now, they're exposed to third-party lawsuits from the acquired company's previous contracts. He smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "They're not worried about third-party claims. They're worried about looking weak in front of their board." I set my pen down slowly. "If we rewrite this section to soften the language, we're creating a liability gap that could cost them millions." Richard straightened, his tone shifting just enough to remind me who was speaking. "That's their call to make, not yours. Rewrite the clauses by end of day and send them to me for review. I'll handle the client conversation." He left before I could respond. I stared at the documents for a long time, trying to reconcile the instruction with the reality of the contract. The language wasn't just protective, it was essential. Removing it would expose the client to risks they didn't fully understand, risks I had explicitly warned against in my initial assessment. But Richard had made it clear this wasn't a discussion. It was an order. I rewrote the clauses. I softened the indemnity language, stripped out the protective provisions, and restructured the section to prioritize optics over security. It felt like diffusing a bomb with a sledgehammer. When I finished, I sent the draft to Richard with a brief note outlining the risks. I needed him to know that I had flagged it, that if this went wrong, it wouldn't be because I hadn't warned him. He never acknowledged the note. 2 days later, the revised contract went to the client with Richard's signature and no mention of my concerns. The deal closed a week after that, and Richard received a commendation from the managing partners for his strategic oversight. My name didn't appear in the final documentation. It never did. I might have let it go if that had been the end of it. But 3 weeks later, I was called into a meeting with Richard and 2 of the managing partners. They sat on one side of the conference table, and I sat alone on the other. The room smelled like coffee and leather, the kind of space designed to make you feel small. Richard opened a folder and slid a document across the table toward me. "We've received a complaint from the client," he said. "They're claiming the liability clauses in the merger agreement were inadequately structured, and they're facing exposure from a lawsuit filed by one of the acquired company's former vendors." I felt my stomach drop. I looked down at the document. It was a formal internal review. It was a prelude to potential disciplinary action. My name was listed as the primary drafter of the contract. "I flagged this issue before the contract was finalized," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I sent you a detailed note outlining the risks of removing the indemnity provisions." Richard didn't blink. "I have no record of that note. What I do have is a draft contract that you submitted with insufficient risk analysis." One of the managing partners, a man named Gerald Porter, leaned forward. "This is a serious lapse in judgment. The client is considering legal action, and if they proceed, this firm's reputation is at stake." I stared at Richard. He met my gaze without flinching, his expression calm, almost sympathetic. He was lying. He knew he was lying, and he knew I knew. But in that room, with those men, the truth didn't matter. What mattered was who had the authority to define it. "I documented everything," I said quietly. "The email trail is in the shared drive." Gerald glanced at Richard, who shook his head slightly. "We've reviewed the files. There's no record of the concerns you're describing." The meeting ended with a formal reprimand placed in my file and a warning that any further lapses would result in termination. I left the conference room and walked back to my desk in a daze. I opened my email archive and searched for the note I had sent to Richard. It wasn't there. I checked the sent folder, the drafts, the trash. Nothing. I logged into the shared drive and searched for the original contract draft with my annotations. The file had been replaced with a clean version. No comments, no revision history. He had erased me, not just from the project, but from the record itself, and I had no way to prove otherwise. I sat at my desk for a long time, staring at my empty inbox. Around me, the office hummed with its usual efficiency. People moved between cubicles, phones rang, keyboards clattered. No one looked at me. No one asked if I was okay. The system had spoken, and I had been weighed and found wanting. The only question left was whether I would accept it. I thought about quitting. I thought about walking into Richard's office and telling him exactly what I thought of him, of the firm, of the entire corrupt infrastructure that allowed men like him to thrive. But I didn't. Because I needed the job, and he knew it. Because walking away would mean starting over, and I didn't have the energy or the safety net to do that. So I stayed. I kept my head down, smiled when required, and went back to work. But something had shifted. I couldn't unsee what I had seen, couldn't unfeel the cold precision with which I had been dismantled. I started keeping my own records, copies of everything stored outside the firm's systems. I started watching Richard more carefully, noting the patterns, the way he moved through the office like a man who believed himself untouchable. He wasn't wrong, but neither was I. The reprimand sat in my file like a ticking clock. I felt it every time I walked into the office, every time Richard passed my desk without looking at me, every time someone asked me to review a document and then quietly reassigned it to someone else. The firm didn't fire people like me outright. They didn't need to. They just made the air thin enough that eventually you suffocated on your own. I kept working. I showed up on time, completed my assignments, and avoided eye contact in meetings. The strategy was simple: make myself invisible, wait for the heat to dissipate, and rebuild credibility one small task at a time. It was humiliating, but it was survival. I told myself it would pass, that memories were short in a place like this, that if I just kept my head down long enough, someone would forget why they had stopped trusting me. But Richard didn't forget. If anything, he leaned in harder. He started assigning me grunt work, tasks that were technically within my purview but designed to waste time. Document formatting, filing compliance reports, drafting routine correspondence that any first-year associate could handle. When I asked about returning to substantive projects, he smiled that same empty smile and told me to focus on the fundamentals. The message was clear. I had stepped out of line, and now I was being reminded of my place. The firm operated on a simple principle: loyalty over competence, silence over truth. I had failed on both counts, and the punishment wasn't termination. It was irrelevance. 3 months passed like that. I watched other associates get promoted, saw my former peers take on high-profile cases while I color-coded spreadsheets and proofread contracts that had already been approved. My performance reviews were technically satisfactory, but they carried a subtext that everyone understood. Meets expectations but lacks initiative. Competent but not a team player. The language was coded, designed to stall my career without giving me grounds to challenge it. I started having trouble sleeping. Not the kind of insomnia where you lie awake thinking, but the kind where you fall asleep fine and then wake up at 3 in the morning with your heart pounding and no clear reason why. I would sit in the dark, replaying the conference room meeting in my head, wondering what I could have done differently. The answer was always the same: nothing. I had been set up, and the setup had been flawless. In early July, the firm announced a major client win. A Fortune 500 company had retained us to handle a complex regulatory defense case, the kind of work that could define a partner's career. Richard was named lead counsel, and he assembled a team of senior associates to support him. I wasn't on the list. I hadn't expected to be, but seeing my name absent from the announcement still felt like a punch to the chest. The next morning, I was called into Richard's office. He was sitting behind his desk, reviewing case files, and he didn't look up when I walked in. "Close the door," he said. I did. He gestured to the chair across from him, and I sat. He finally looked at me, his expression unreadable. "I'm bringing you onto the regulatory defense team," he said. I blinked. I wasn't on the announcement. That was an oversight. You'll be supporting junior research and document review. Nothing client-facing, but it's a chance to get back into substantive work. He leaned back in his chair, studying me. "I'm giving you an opportunity here. Don't make me regret it." I should have been grateful. I should have thanked him and walked out feeling like maybe, just maybe, I was being given a second chance. But something about the way he said it, the careful phrasing, the implication that this was a gift rather than something I had earned, made my skin crawl. "I appreciate the opportunity," I said, keeping my voice neutral. He nodded and went back to his files, dismissing me without another word. I left his office and went straight to the bathroom. I locked myself in a stall and stood there for a long time, trying to steady my breathing. This wasn't a second chance. This was a test. He was bringing me onto the team to see if I would play along, if I had learned my lesson. And if I failed again, there would be no reprimand this time. There would just be an exit interview and a polite suggestion that I pursue opportunities elsewhere. The work was exactly what he had promised. Document review, endless hours of reading through regulatory filings and compliance reports, flagging relevant sections for the senior associates to analyze. It was tedious, mind-numbing work, but I did it without complaint. I stayed late, double-checked everything, and made sure my output was flawless. I wanted to prove that I could be trusted, that I wasn't a liability. But the more I worked on the case, the more I started noticing things. Small inconsistencies in the timeline, discrepancies between the client's public statements and their internal communications. Nothing dramatic, just details that didn't quite line up. I flagged them in my notes, thinking they might be relevant for the defense strategy. When I mentioned them to one of the senior associates, he glanced at my annotations and told me to focus on the assigned documents. I kept digging. Not because I was trying to cause problems, but because it was my job. The case hinged on whether the client had knowingly violated environmental regulations, and the defense strategy was built on the argument that any violations were unintentional, the result of administrative oversights rather than deliberate misconduct. But the internal emails I was reviewing told a different story. They showed a pattern of ignored warnings, deliberate underreporting, and calculated risk assessments that prioritized cost savings over compliance. I compiled the findings into a memo and sent it to Richard. I framed it carefully, presenting the information as a potential risk to the defense strategy rather than an accusation. If opposing counsel uncovered these communications during discovery, our entire argument would collapse. We needed to address it proactively, either by adjusting our strategy or by advising the client to settle before the case went to trial. Richard called me into his office the next day. This time, the door was already closed when I arrived. He was standing by the window looking out at the city, his hands clasped behind his back. "Sit down," he said without turning around. I sat. He stayed by the window for a long moment, then turned to face me. "I read your memo," he said. "It's thorough. Too thorough." I frowned. "I don't understand." He walked over to his desk and picked up a printed copy of my memo. He held it up, then dropped it into the trash can beside his chair. "The client is paying us to defend them, not to build a case against themselves. Your job is to find support for our strategy, not undermine it." "I'm not undermining anything. I'm identifying a risk." "You're creating a risk." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. "If you put this in writing and it ends up in the case file, it becomes discoverable. You're handing opposing counsel a roadmap to dismantle our defense." I stared at him. "So you want me to ignore it?" "I want you to focus on the work you were assigned." He sat down, his tone softening slightly. "Look, I understand you're trying to be diligent, but there's a difference between diligence and overreach. You need to learn when to stop digging." I left his office feeling like I had swallowed something sharp. He was right about one thing. Putting those findings in a memo had been a mistake, but not for the reasons he thought. The mistake was believing that honesty mattered more than loyalty, that the firm's duty to the client had limits. I went back to my desk and opened the case files again. I didn't delete my notes, but I didn't share them either. I just kept reading, kept flagging inconsistencies, kept building a mental map of what the client had actually done versus what we were claiming they had done. And I started to understand something I hadn't fully grasped before. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. Richard wasn't corrupt, at least not in any way that the firm would recognize. He was doing his job, protecting the client, maximizing billable hours, and maintaining the relationships that kept the money flowing. The fact that it required lies, strategic omissions, and the occasional sacrificial associate was just the cost of doing business. I had two choices. I could keep my head down, stop asking questions, and hope that eventually I would be forgiven for my earlier transgressions. Or I could do something that couldn't be undone. I sat at my desk for a long time that night, staring at the files on my screen. Outside, the office had emptied out. The cleaning crew moved through the hallways, emptying trash cans and vacuuming carpets. I could hear the faint hum of the HVAC system, the distant wail of a siren on the street below. I opened a new folder on my personal drive and started copying files. I copied only the key documents, the internal emails, the compliance reports, the risk assessments. I told myself I was just keeping a backup, that I might need them later to protect myself. But I knew what I was really doing. I was building an insurance policy, and once I had it, there would be no going back. The files sat on my personal drive like a loaded gun. I didn't look at them for 2 weeks. I went to work, completed my assignments, and pretended that nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I had crossed a line, and the knowledge of it followed me everywhere. In meetings, at my desk, on the subway ride home. I had taken something that didn't belong to me, and the firm had policies about that. Policies that ended careers and sometimes led to criminal charges. I told myself I would delete them, that I had made a mistake in a moment of panic and the smart thing to do was erase the evidence and forget it had ever happened. But I didn't delete them, because every time I opened my laptop and hovered over the folder, I remembered Richard's face when he dropped my memo into the trash. I remembered the way he had looked at me like I was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be heard. In late August, the case went to trial. The firm rented out a conference room on the 3rd floor and converted it into a war room, with whiteboards covering the walls and bankers' boxes stacked in neat rows along the perimeter. Richard held daily strategy sessions, and I was allowed to sit in the back and take notes. My role was purely administrative, but being in the room meant I could see how the pieces were moving. The prosecution's case was strong but circumstantial. They had evidence of regulatory violations, but they struggled to prove intent. Richard's strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Acknowledge the violations, blame them on mid-level managers who had since been fired, and position the client's executive team as victims of their own employees' negligence. It was a classic deflection play, and it was working. The jury seemed sympathetic, the judge seemed skeptical of the prosecution's timeline, and the media coverage framed the case as an overreach by an aggressive regulatory agency. I watched it unfold with a strange sense of detachment. I knew the truth, or at least a version of it that contradicted the narrative Richard was building. But the truth was irrelevant. What mattered was the story, and Richard was a master storyteller. He didn't lie, not exactly. He just omitted the parts that didn't fit, rearranged the sequence of events, and let the jury fill in the gaps with assumptions that favored his client. Halfway through the trial, I was assigned to review a new batch of discovery documents that the prosecution had submitted. They were routine filings, mostly duplicates of materials we had already analyzed. I started working through them mechanically, flagging anything that might require follow-up. Then I found it. It was an email chain between the client's CEO and their head of operations, dated 18 months before the alleged violations. The prosecution had included it in a larger batch of communications, and it had been misfiled under a generic subject line that made it easy to overlook. But the content was devastating. The CEO explicitly instructed the operations team to delay compliance upgrades until after the quarterly earnings report, citing cost concerns and shareholder expectations. The head of operations pushed back, warning that the delay could result in regulatory violations. The CEO responded with a single line, "Handle it quietly." I read it 3 times, my hands shaking slightly. This was the smoking gun the prosecution had been looking for. It proved intent, showed a deliberate decision to prioritize profits over compliance, and directly contradicted the defense's entire narrative. If this email made it into evidence, the case was over. The client would lose, Richard's strategy would collapse, and the firm's reputation would take a hit. I looked around the war room. No one was paying attention to me. I was just another associate buried in paperwork, invisible. I could print the email, walk it over to Richard, and let him handle it. That was the protocol. That was my job. Instead, I saved a copy to my personal drive. Then I closed the document and moved on to the next file. I didn't tell anyone about the email. Not Richard, not the senior associates, not the paralegals who were supposed to be cataloging discovery materials. I filed it under a vague reference code and buried it in the database where no one would think to look. It was a small act of sabotage, so minor that it could have been an honest mistake. But it wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. The trial continued. Richard delivered his closing argument with the kind of controlled passion that made you forget he was lying. He talked about good people making hard decisions, about the complexity of regulatory frameworks, about the danger of criminalizing honest mistakes. The jury deliberated for 2 days and returned a verdict of not guilty on all counts. The client walked free. Richard was hailed as a legal genius, and the firm's managing partners threw a celebration dinner at an upscale steakhouse downtown. I wasn't invited to the dinner. I found out about the verdict from an email blast sent to the entire firm. I was still at my desk, reviewing documents for a different case, when the news came through. People around me cheered, high-fived, made plans to go out for drinks. I sat quietly, staring at my screen, feeling nothing. That night, I went home and opened the folder on my personal drive. I looked at the files I had copied, the evidence of what the client had actually done, the proof that Richard had built his defense on a foundation of strategic omissions. And I looked at the email I had buried, the one that could have changed everything. I had kept it hidden because I wanted to see what would happen. I wanted to know if Richard would win even without addressing the most damning piece of evidence. And he had. He had won because the system was designed to let him win. Because juries trusted men in expensive suits, because the prosecution had been outmaneuvered at every turn. But I had the email. And that meant the victory wasn't complete. It was provisional, contingent on my continued silence. Richard didn't know it yet, but he was vulnerable in a way he had never been before. Because I had something he didn't know existed, and I had the power to decide what happened to it. I sat in my apartment for hours, staring at the screen. Outside, the city hummed with its usual indifference. Cars passed on the street below. People walked their dogs. Someone laughed in the building next door. The world kept turning, oblivious to the choice I was facing. I could delete the files. I could walk into work tomorrow, congratulate Richard on his victory, and go back to being the invisible associate who kept her head down and did what she was told. It would be easy. It would be safe. And it would mean accepting that everything I had endured, every humiliation, every erasure had been for nothing. Or I could do something else. Something that couldn't be undone, that would burn bridges I couldn't rebuild, that would almost certainly destroy my career and possibly my life. But it would also mean that Richard's victory came with a price, that the truth, even if it arrived too late to matter in court, would still exist somewhere in the record. I thought about the firm's policies on document retention. I thought about attorney-client privilege, about confidentiality agreements, about the ethics rules that governed what I could and couldn't disclose. I thought about the risks. What I was considering could be classified as theft, a breach of fiduciary duty, or career suicide wrapped in a criminal charge. And then I thought about the conference room, about Richard sliding that document across the table, about the way he had erased me from the record as if I had never existed. I opened a new browser window and searched for the contact information for the regulatory agency that had prosecuted the case. It took me 20 minutes to find the right department, another 10 to draft an anonymous email that was vague enough to avoid immediate identification but specific enough to get their attention. I attached the CEO's email, the one that proved intent, the one that Richard had never seen because I had made sure he wouldn't. I hovered over the send button for a long time. My finger trembled slightly, a physical manifestation of the part of me that still wanted to pull back, to choose safety over truth. But I didn't pull back. I hit send. The email disappeared into the void, and I sat in the dark, waiting for the world to catch up with what I had just done. It would take time. The agency would need to verify the document, reopen the investigation, build a new case. It might take months, maybe years. Richard might never even know I was the one who had sent it, but I would know. And that knowledge settled over me like a weight, cold and final. I had stepped outside the system, and there was no path back in. Whatever happened next, I had chosen it, and I would have to live with the consequences. I closed my laptop and sat in silence. The apartment felt smaller than it had before, the walls pressing in. I thought about calling someone, a friend, a family member, anyone who might understand what I had just done. But there was no one to call, because no one would understand. They would tell me I had made a mistake, that I should have kept my head down, that revenge wasn't worth the cost. But this wasn't revenge. It was something colder, more deliberate. It was the refusal to let a lie stand unchallenged, even if challenging it meant dismantling my own life in the process. I went to bed but didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of my own breathing. And somewhere in the city, in a server farm or an office building or a bureaucrat's inbox, my email sat waiting to detonate. Nothing happened for 3 weeks. I went to work, completed my assignments, and waited for the world to end. Every time my phone rang, every time someone knocked on my office door, I braced for the confrontation. But it never came. The firm moved on to the next case. Richard moved on to the next client, and I remained exactly where I had been. Invisible, irrelevant, a minor cog in a machine that had already forgotten I existed. I started to wonder if the email had even been received, if it had been filtered into spam, dismissed as a crank complaint, or simply ignored by an agency that had already moved on from a case they had lost. The uncertainty was worse than any punishment. I had risked everything for a gesture that might never matter, and the only thing I had gained was the knowledge that I was capable of betrayal. Then, on a Friday afternoon in mid-September, I saw Richard in the hallway outside the managing partner's suite. He was standing very still, his face pale, holding a document that I couldn't see from where I stood. One of the managing partners was speaking to him in a low, clipped tone. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read the body language. Something had gone wrong. I went back to my desk and tried to focus on work. An hour later, an email went out to the entire litigation department. The regulatory agency had filed a motion to reopen the case based on newly discovered evidence. The firm was convening an emergency meeting to assess the situation and determine next steps. All personnel who had worked on the case were required to attend. The meeting was held in the largest conference room on the executive floor. 30 people packed into a space designed for 20. Standing along the walls, sitting on the floor, all of us waiting to hear how bad it was. Richard stood at the head of the table, flanked by 2 managing partners and the firm's general counsel. His expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the edge of the table. The general counsel spoke first. As you're all aware, the agency has filed a motion to reopen the case. They claim to have obtained evidence that was not presented during the original trial. Specifically, an internal email between the client's CEO and head of operations that suggests premeditation in the regulatory violations. A murmur ran through the room. Someone asked how the agency had obtained the email. The general counsel glanced at Richard, then back at the room. That's what we're trying to determine. The email was part of the original discovery materials, but it was never flagged or entered into evidence. We're conducting an internal review to understand how this oversight occurred. Oversight. The word hung in the air, a polite fiction that everyone in the room understood. This wasn't an oversight. This was sabotage, and the firm was going to find out who had done it. I sat very still, my hands folded in my lap, my face blank. Around me, people whispered, speculated, looked at each other with suspicion. I felt Richard's eyes sweep across the room, lingering on faces, searching for a tell. When his gaze passed over me, I didn't look away. I met his eyes for a fraction of a second, then looked down at my notes as if I were just another concerned associate trying to process the news. The meeting ended with instructions to preserve all case-related materials and to cooperate fully with the internal investigation. We filed out in silence, the weight of what had just been said settling over the department like a fog. I went back to my desk, logged into my computer, and opened the case files. My hands were steady. I had expected this. The investigation moved quickly. The firm hired an outside forensics team to review the document database, trace access logs, and identify anyone who had handled the email in question. I knew they would find my name eventually. I had accessed the file, saved a copy, and buried it under a vague reference code. The digital trail was there, faint but traceable. I spent the weekend cleaning out my apartment. Not because I was planning to leave, but because I needed something to do with my hands. I packed up books, sorted through old files, threw away things I had been holding on to for no reason. It felt like preparation, like getting ready for a storm that I could see on the horizon but couldn't avoid. On Monday morning, I was called into the general counsel's office. Richard was already there, sitting in one of the chairs across from the desk. The general counsel, a woman named Margaret Hill, gestured for me to sit. I did. She opened a folder and slid a printout across the desk toward me. It was an access log showing the date and time I had opened the email file, the duration I had spent viewing it, and the fact that I had saved a copy to an external location. "Can you explain this?" Margaret asked. Her tone was neutral, almost kind. It made everything worse. I looked at the log, then at Richard, then back at Margaret. I found the email during discovery review. I flagged it for follow-up, but I must have misfiled it. I didn't realize it hadn't been entered into evidence. Richard leaned forward. "You saved a copy to your personal drive." "I was keeping a backup. I do that with all critical documents." "And you didn't think to mention it during trial prep? During closing arguments? At any point before the verdict?" I met his gaze. "I filed it according to protocol. If it wasn't reviewed, that's not my fault." Margaret closed the folder. "The forensics team found evidence that you sent an email to the regulatory agency 3 weeks ago. The email contained the document in question, along with a brief summary of its contents. The metadata matches your device." The room went very quiet. Richard stared at me, his expression shifting from confusion to comprehension to something colder. "You leaked it." I didn't deny it. There was no point. "I sent them evidence that should have been part of the trial, evidence that you chose to ignore." "I never saw that email," Richard said, his voice low. "You buried it deliberately." "You buried me deliberately." I kept my tone even, but I could feel the anger rising hot and sharp. "You erased my work, destroyed my credibility, and blamed me for your mistakes. You built your career on making people like me disappear. I just made sure you couldn't do it again." Margaret raised a hand, cutting off whatever Richard was about to say. "This is a termination-level offense. You violated attorney-client privilege, breached confidentiality agreements, and potentially exposed the firm to liability. You're being terminated effective immediately, and we will be referring this matter to the State Bar for disciplinary review." I nodded. I had expected this too. "I understand. You also need to understand that the client will likely pursue legal action against you personally. What you did constitutes theft of proprietary information and could result in criminal charges." "I understand," I said again. Margaret stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Richard stayed seated, staring at me like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Why?" he asked. "You threw away your career for what? Revenge?" I stood, gathering my things. "No. I threw away my career because I couldn't live with being complicit anymore. You're going to lose this case, Richard, and when you do, everyone is going to know it's because you built your defense on a lie." I walked out of the office without waiting for a response. Security escorted me back to my desk, watched while I packed my personal belongings into a box and walked me out of the building. It was over in less than an hour. 6 years of work gone, my career finished, my reputation destroyed. I stood on the sidewalk outside the firm's building, holding a cardboard box and feeling strangely light. The city moved around me, indifferent and relentless. People rushed past, absorbed in their own lives, their own problems. No one looked at me. No one cared. I took the subway home. The train was crowded, packed with commuters heading to jobs that probably made them just as miserable as mine had made me. I stood in the corner holding onto the pole and thought about what came next. The Barr investigation, the potential lawsuit, the years it would take to rebuild any semblance of a career. I thought about the fact that I might never work in law again, that I had sacrificed everything for a principle that most people would call naive. But I also thought about the email sitting in the regulatory agency's database, the evidence that would force the case to reopen, the truth that Richard couldn't erase no matter how hard he tried. It wouldn't undo the damage he had done, wouldn't restore my career or my reputation, but it would cost him something. And that was enough. When I got home, I set the box down by the door and opened my laptop. There was an email from Margaret confirming my termination and outlining the next steps in the legal process. There was a message from a former colleague, brief and formal, saying she was sorry to hear I was leaving. There was nothing from Richard. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt permanent. I had burned every bridge, severed every connection, and walked away from the only professional identity I had ever known. I had no job, no prospects, and no clear path forward, but I also had no illusions left. I knew exactly what the system was, what it demanded, and what it did to people who refused to comply. I had spent 6 years trying to survive within it, bending and compromising and swallowing my objections in exchange for stability. And in the end, the system had chewed me up anyway. So I had made a different choice. Not a heroic one, not a smart one, but a choice that was mine. I had refused to let the lie stand, even though it cost me everything. I had chosen truth over safety, integrity over survival, and I would live with the consequences, whatever they were. I sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the city hum outside my window. Somewhere out there, Richard was probably strategizing, figuring out how to contain the damage, how to spin the story in a way that protected him. Somewhere out there, the regulatory agency was building a new case, one that would drag the firm and the client back into court. And somewhere in between, I existed. Not a hero, not a martyr, just a person who had decided that some prices were worth paying. The world wouldn't change because of what I had done. The system would grind on, crushing people who got in its way, rewarding those who played along. But I would know. I would know that I had stood at the edge of complicity and chosen to step back, even when it meant falling. And that knowledge, cold and final and mine, was the only victory I would ever get.